Back in the 1960s and 70s, a lorry wasn't a computer on wheels. It was steel, a diesel engine, and a driver who knew every bolt on it. There were no screens telling you what was wrong. If something rattled, you climbed underneath in a lay-by and you sorted it yourself. And here's the strange part. Some of those old wagons, the ones your dad or your granddad drove up and down the A1 in the pouring rain, are still working today. Still pulling. Still starting on a freezing morning when the fancy new motors are sat in the workshop waiting for a sensor. Think about what that meant for the men who ran them. No emissions gear to clog up, no electronic brain to throw a wobbly and strand you on the hard shoulder. Just an engine, a gearbox, and a chassis you could trust with your livelihood. These are 10 classics from the golden age of British haulage, counting down to the toughest of them all. Number 10. The Bedford TM. By the early 70s, the Swedes had landed, and British operators were falling head over heels for the Volvo F88 and the Scania 110. Bedford, the Dunstable firm owned by General Motors, had spent years building honest little distribution lorries like the TK and the KM, but for the long motorway haul they needed something with real muscle. So in 1974 they gave us the TM. That big, square, modern cab turned heads up and down the country. Some reckon Volvo borrowed a few ideas from it for the F10 that came later. Under the floor sat a Detroit diesel two-stroke, a V6 or a V8 that revved and howled like nothing else on the road. And that was the catch. British drivers were raised on slow, lazy gardeners, and that screaming American engine never quite won their hearts. Later you could have a Cummins, or Bedford's own 8.2 Blue, and the chassis underneath was genuinely strong and willing. It was a proper heavyweight from a maker most folk only thought of for vans. You'll still find TM's grafting in the far corners of the world. Long after the factory closed its gates, it wasn't perfect, but it was far tougher than anyone expected from Bedford. And think about the sums. A TM could be patched up with ordinary tools by a fitter who knew what he was doing, whereas a modern tractor unit with a fault often means a low loader to the main dealer and a 4-figure bill before anyone's even lifted a spanner. The old Bedford asked for graft, not a laptop. Number 9. The Guy Big J down in Fallings Park, Wolverhampton. Guy Motors built lorries with a reputation for being rugged little tanks, and the Big J of 1964 was their big push into the motorway age. The J stood for Jaguar, who owned them at the time. Early ones ran a high-revving Cummins V6, and to be fair it gave the firm a few headaches on fuel and reliability. But operators soon swapped to the engine they trusted most, the Gardner 6LX, along with Rolls-Royce and AEC units. And that's when the Big J came in for its day, built so parts swapped between models to keep spares simple. The motor panel's cab was tough steel. The axles came from Kirkstall Forge and ENV, names that meant something. A Gardner-powered Big J would plod along all day, sip its fuel and ask for almost nothing in return. They were exported all over the world, into Africa and the Far East, where they earned a name for surviving rough roads and rougher treatment. Plenty of operators kept them going for decades because they simply refused to wear out. A Guy was a driver's wagon, honest and dependable, from a black country firm that built them to graft. And that's where the old Guy still has the legs on a modern motor, out on a rough quarry track or a flooded farm lane, where today's low aerodynamic units would be grounded and bleeping warnings. A Big J just shrugged and carried on. Ground clearance, a simple driveline, and a gardener that didn't care about the weather. That's why so many ended up in the toughest jobs in the toughest countries, and were still going strong long after they were written off the books. Number 8. The Leyland Marathon. This one is the story of British industry trying to fight back. By 1973, the homegrown makers were watching the Swedes walk off with their customers, and Leyland needed an answer for the long haul. The Marathon was it. The clever bit was under the bonnet. Rather than chase a brand new engine, the engineers took the rock-solid AECAV 766 and reworked it into the Leyland TL12 with new fueling and stronger internals. The result was an engine known for tremendous bottom-end pull and real durability, giving around 270 horsepower with bags of torque low down where a loaded Arctic needs it. You could also have a Rolls-Royce or a Cummins if you wanted more. The cab was a raised version of the old Ergomatic, and for the first time, Leyland offered a proper factory sleeper, a big deal for the trunk drivers living in their cabs all week. The early marathons were rushed out and had their teething troubles, and we won't pretend otherwise. But once sorted, a good one with that TL12 was a tough, willing motor that hauled hard for years. It was Britain having a go, and the engine at its heart was a genuine survivor. The TL12 would rack up the miles between rebuilds, and when it finally did need work, any decent diesel fitter could strip it on the bench, no special diagnostic required. Compare that to a modern engine, where a sniff of trouble brings on the dreaded limp mode and a tow to the dealer. The Marathon's heart was old school iron, and old school iron forgives. Number 7. The AEC Mammoth Major and Mandator. Out of the famous Scammell works in West London came some of the most respected lorries Britain ever built. In 1966, the Mandator stood as the heavyweight champion of the new motorways, built to handle the fresh 32-ton limit. It came with the ergomatic tilt cab, which was a revelation at the time, because a mechanic could finally tip the whole cab forward and get at the engine, instead of working through a hole in the floor. And what an engine it was! The AV760, a 12.5 litre straight 6, with a deep rhythmic beat you could hear coming a mile off. That engine earned a cast-iron reputation for reliability, and some examples ran past 300,000 miles with nothing worse than a few hairline cracks. There was a V8 version too, but in fairness that one was rushed and underfunded and became the weak link. So the 6 is the one the old hands remember fondly. The Mammoth Major was the 8-wheeler workhorse, hauling and tipping the length of the land. Plenty of those simple, reliable 6s are still on the road today, decades after Southall fell silent. A proper bit of British engineering. And here's the measure of it. That AV766 was so well made that operators trusted it to run hundreds of thousands of miles on nothing more than oil changes and a bit of care. There's no fancy after-treatment to clog, no sensor to fail in the cold, just a big lazy diesel doing what it was built to do. A modern motor might sip far less fuel, and good luck to it, but very few will still be earning a living after half a century. The Mandator can, and some still are. If you're enjoying this trip back down the A-roads, do hit that subscribe button. We cover classic British lorries and the drivers who ran them every single week. Now back to the countdown. Number 6. The Scammell Crusader. Scammell, of Watford, were the masters of the heavy and the difficult. This was the firm behind the legendary Contractor, the tank transporter and heavy haulage monster that could shift hundreds of tons. So when Scammell turned their hand to a motorway tractor unit, the result had serious pedigree. The Crusader landed at the 1968 Earl's Court Show, and it was a proper line hauler. Many ran a Detroit diesel 8x71 two-stroke, giving around 273 horsepower, though plenty had Rolls-Royce or Cummins power instead, mated to a 15-speed Fuller Road Ranger box and tough Albion hub reduction axles. It was a long-legged, hard-pulling wagon, built to eat the miles between cities. But the real Scammell magic was that heavy-duty bloodline. These were people who built recovery trucks for the army and machines to drag battle tanks across deserts, and that thinking went into everything they made. A Scammell was overbuilt by habit. Drivers who ran them talk about how solid and planted they felt, how little fuss they made. Number 5. The Foden S80 and S83. Now we head to Sandbach in Cheshire, home to two great names that sat almost side by side. Foden was the older of them, and by the 70s their S80 and S83 were stalwarts of the British fleet. Like the best of the era, you built it your way. Gardner, Cummins or Rolls-Royce for the engine, paired to one of Foden's own gearboxes, including those clever 12-speed epicyclic boxes that were generations ahead of their rivals. The chassis was stout, and the S80 became the king of the 8-wheeled tipper, taking nearly a third of that whole market at its peak. Picture a Gardner-engined Foden 8-legger loaded with stone, plodding out of a quarry without a care in the world. That was its natural home. These were no-nonsense wagons for operators who counted every penny and wanted a lorry that would still be earning in 20 years. The split-screen cab looked old-fashioned even when it was new, but nobody bought a Foden for its looks. They bought it because a Foden worked, and kept working, through muck and graft and brutal tipper duty. A true Cheshire workhorse with engineering you could rely on. And on a tipper site, that reliability was everything. Dust, grit, overloading and rough ground are exactly the conditions that bring a sensitive modern lorry out in a cold sweat, yet that's where a Gardner Foden felt most at home. The repair bills were small, the engine sipped its fuel, and the whole thing was built to be patched up and sent straight back to work. Hauliers didn't replace them because they wore out. They replaced them because the world moved on. Number 4. The ERF just up the road in the same town. ERF were the other sandbag legend, and there was real family history there, because the firm was founded by a Foden who believed in diesel over steam. ERF built lorries the smart way, buying in the best bits and assembling them with care. Gardner, Cummins or Rolls-Royce engines, fuller boxes, the components hauliers asked for by name, but ERF's real masterstroke was the cab. While other makers fought a losing battle against rust, ERF developed their SP cab, a steel frame wrapped in plastic and glass fibre panels that simply would not corrode. The lads nicknamed it the Plastic Fantastic. It was lighter, it shrugged off the British weather, and after a knock you could repair it far more easily than a steel cab. ERF were also the first British maker to fit fail-safe spring brakes, a safety idea so good the whole industry copied it. Their B-series of 1974 brought a tilt cab and a factory sleeper, properly modern kit. An ERF was the thinking haulier's lorry, light on its feet, kind on fuel with a Gardner up front, and built to dodge the rot that killed so many of its rivals. That rust-proof cab is a bigger deal than it sounds. The thing that finishes off most old lorries, and plenty of newer ones too, isn't the engine at all. It's corrosion eating the cab away around a perfectly good driveline. ERF solved that decades before anyone else, which is exactly why so many of their wagons survived to be lovingly restored. Clever, durable and very, very British. Number 3. The Scania LB140 V8. Now for the machine that changed what drivers expected from an engine. In 1969, Scania launched the LB140, and tucked inside it was a 14-litre V8 producing 350 horsepower. At a stroke, it was the most powerful lorry in Europe. For a generation of British drivers used to a Gardner pulling out 150, climbing into a Scania V8 was like stepping into another world. There was power to spare on every hill, comfort they had never known, and that unmistakable V8 burble that still gives enthusiasts goosebumps. They called it the King of the Road, and the name stuck. But raw power was only half the story. That V8 wasn't just fast, it was built to last. The Scania V8 became one of the most respected engines in all of heavy haulage, famous for shrugging off enormous mileages and brutal work. Drivers loved them, operators trusted them, and the V8 legend Scania started in 1969 is still going strong on the motorways today. Few engines, old or new, have ever earned that kind of loyalty. The big Scania didn't just beat the British lorries on paper, it won the drivers' hearts, and it backed it up with sheer staying power. Plenty of those old V8s went round the clock more than once, clocking up a couple of million kilometres in the right hands, the kind of mileage that makes a modern fleet manager wince. A new Scania is cleaner, safer and far more economical, no question, but that 1969 V8 set a standard for hard-working longevity that the mark is still trading on to this very day. Number 2. The Volvo F88. If the Scania V8 was the showstopper, the Volvo F88 was the lorry that quietly changed British haulage forever. When it arrived in 1965, the F88 was something operators here had never really seen. A turbocharged engine as standard, a synchromesh gearbox instead of a crash box power steering, and a cab where a driver could actually rest properly on a long night away. The early imports came over from Sweden, and Volvo soon began assembling them in Scotland to keep up with demand. Hauliers who tried one rarely went back. It was comfortable, it was reliable, and it pulled like a train, and word spread fast through the transport cafes. The F88 became the yardstick that every other lorry was measured against, and it cracked open the door that let every European maker into Britain. The home firms were caught napping, and many never recovered. That 9.6 litre Turbo 6 was a tough, long-lived unit, and plenty of F88s are still cherished and working in the harshest parts of the world. It is no exaggeration to say this one lorry rewrote the rules of British trucking, and it earned its place here on toughness as much as comfort. That Turbo 6 would soldier on through appalling heat, dust and neglect, which is why F88s ended up hauling across deserts and mountains in countries where a breakdown could be deadly. Simple to fix, strong in the chassis and willing to the last. A modern truck would leave it standing on a fuel gauge, but for outright survival in the rough, the old Volvo still has very little to fear. Number 1. The Atkinson Borderer, and so to the toughest of the lot. Back in Preston, Atkinson built lorries for hauliers who didn't care about frills and cared about everything else. The Borderer of 1968 was the pick of the range, and it was put together from the hardest wearing parts money could buy. A Gardner engine, usually the legendary 180, driving through a David Brown gearbox to a Kirkstall drive axle. That was the Atkinson recipe, and the men who ran them swore motor, because it would graft from dawn to dusk and never let you down. The cab was glass fibre, so it never rusted, and if you bent one, you could practically rebuild it over a weekend. Around 4,000 Borderers were built, and here is the proof of how good they were. They outlasted the newer lorries that replaced them, and so many ended up spending years as hard-working shunters in dockyards and depots, simply because nothing else would take the punishment. Decades on, you'll still find Borderers earning their keep and pulling crowds at every rally. Simple, indestructible, repairable anywhere, and as honest as the day is long. Think about what it takes to earn that crown. A lorry from the late 60s that outlived its own replacements, then spent another lifetime doing the heaviest, dirtiest shunting work going, and still came up smiling. No modern unit, for all its clever electronics, is being built to graft for 60 years on a Gardner and a grease gun,